Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Scottish Land Commission event. We're just going to wait for a couple of minutes while everyone comes in from the waiting room. We have well over 200 people signed up for this event, so it's going to take a couple of minutes, but it's fantastic to see such interest in this topic and in the paper we're going to be discussing. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us, and welcome to this online event hosted by the Scottish Land Commission, the Carbon Rush, Understanding the Role of Carbon Offsetting and Investing in the Land Market. We're just waiting for the numbers to finally level off, but I think we should go. We have only an hour for this afternoon's event, so we should probably get going. So this is the second event in a series of conversations hosted by the Scottish Land Commission, which aims to stimulate discussion around what the steps needed to meet the net zero target for climate change, what those steps mean in terms of Scotland's land and in terms of communities. It's clear that all of our land across the country needs to be delivering more to meet both the climate challenge and the biodiversity crisis. We have some very significant opportunities there, but there are also some significant risks. For example, the risk of greenwashing in terms of carbon offset systems, and also in terms of how local communities are involved and can benefit from these projects. And it's the identification, the management and the mitigation of these risks in terms of their relationship with land reform that the Scottish Land Commission has been focusing on in the last few months. So my name is MacInnes. I'm a Scottish Land Commissioner, and I'm joining you from my home in Applecross in the North West Highlands. I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's event, and I'm joined by four very inspiring panelists who I'm going to introduce in a minute. But I also wanted to start by introducing my two Land Commission colleagues, Jess and Sarah, who are behind the scenes helping to make this event run smoothly from a technical perspective. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, including the chat function. The video recording might be published on our YouTube channel, so please have a read of the details of the privacy of privacy relating to this that are going to be in the chat function shortly. In terms of the format for this afternoon's discussion, we're going to be starting with a presentation from Dr. Jill Robbie and Dr. Giedre Jokubauskaite, who are both from the University of Glasgow, on a paper they recently published for the Scottish Land Commission. We'll then have two short responses from Professor Dave Reay of the University of Edinburgh and Don MacLeod, from a partner with Turcan Connell, before moving out to a broader discussion with all of the rest of you. We're going to be using the chat function for you to ask questions to the panelists, as well as a way of connecting to each other and discussing things during the event. So please ask your questions as we start the presentations, so that we have a good list to start from when we open out to the board question and answer and discussion. So finally, we'd like to ask you to complete a short survey, which will be emailed out to you at the end of this event in order for us to get feedback on how we organise future online events. So this afternoon's discussion will focus on Dr. Jill and Dr. Giedre's paper, which is called Carbon Markets, Public Interest and Land Ownership in Scotland. This was published last week on the Scottish Land Commission website, alongside another paper by Professor Helm, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. His paper looks at carbon offsetting and land use. The links to both of these papers and other parts of the Land Commission's work relating to natural capital, land reform and the carbon markets are going to be added into the chat function as we go through the event this afternoon by Jess and Sarah. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first two speakers. Dr. Jill is a senior lecturer in private law at Glasgow University, with substantial expertise in property law and sustainability. And Dr. Giedre is a lecturer in international law at the University of Glasgow, whose research focuses on the legal framework for development finance, including climate finance and community accountability. So over to you, Jill.
Thank you, Megan. And in my 5 minutes, I'm just going to briefly outline some of the headline analysis from our paper, and then I will pass over to Gigi, who will follow up with some of our recommendations. So thank you for the commission of writing this paper, and also to the people, some of which are in this room, who gave us feedback on earlier drafts from this paper. So the discussion paper is about the voluntary carbon markets. And carbon markets allow businesses to offset their CO2 emissions by buying carbon units from other market participants. And there are 2 codes through which verified carbon units can be created and sold in the UK, and these are the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code. And both of these codes are aiming to trigger widespread woodland creation and peatland restoration to sequester carbon emissions or reduce emissions. So quickly, very briefly, how do they work? The codes allow landowners, developers to register a carbon project on the UK Land Registry to get validation of the project, and then finally verify the project using an independent auditor, which generates carbon units. The carbon units can then be sold to a buyer through a series of contracts between landowner, developer, and buyer, or through a carbon broker. So registrations of projects have been rapidly increasing in Scotland, and we focus mostly in the paper on the Woodland Carbon Code because that's what's been most popular. So we investigate 3 issues in relation to carbon markets in Scotland: environmental impact, inclusion in decision-making, and distribution of benefits. And I'll just go over our findings of these 3 areas briefly. So the first issue is environmental impact. This is upon the background that the Scottish Government is committed to tackling the 2 crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. It's a principle of the codes that the project should be of high environmental quality, and some afforestation projects require an environmental impact assessment to be undertaken. But the validation and verification processes, so those are the processes that create the carbon units, through those processes, the auditor doesn't check whether environmental law has been complied with, and there's no requirement of monitoring over the course of the projects. Further, carbon units can be generated by primarily commercial forestry projects, which involve clear felling. So not all developers design their projects like this, but we have to be really careful, I think, when we're designing these codes and implementing these codes, that we don't just provide additional support to a primarily commercial activity with any other broader environmental impacts being incidental. And there's a general point to be made about carbon markets, which is when you have one focus on a particular ecosystem service, like carbon sequestration, this might lead to neglecting other environmental elements. So as we are discovering in the climate crisis, ecosystems are complex, they're dynamic, they interact in really unpredictable ways. And that can't really be captured in a simplistic formula. So we recommend taking this ecosystems-based approach, which has a holistic approach to environmental management at a landscape scale. So that's the first issue. Second issue is inclusion in decision-making. Community impact and empowerment are key priorities of the Scottish Government, and community engagement should be proportionate to the impact of the decision, collaborative and ongoing. And it's important that the people who are engaged are not just those who also have property rights, so other landowners, but generally members of the community. The Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code involve long-term land use change so that the developer can sell carbon units. So that locks in a particular type of land use for a long period of time. Woodland projects can last up to 100 years from the start date of the project. So it's clear there's going to be intergenerational impacts on communities. And again, there are principles in the codes regarding community engagement. And if public grants have been applied for, Scottish Forestry will have carried out consultation processes, including publication on a public register. However, much of the additional community engagement is just merely recommended as good practice, rather than being a legal requirement. So there's a risk that developers carry out engagement to the minimum extent possible. Further, it's very difficult to factor in community impacts over such long timescales. So if you consult with a community at the beginning of a project, it's not the same community in 30 or 50 years' time. So there might be new community needs such as extra housing capacity, additional community facilities, or other land use conflicts which arise in the future. We can just see how community priorities have changed over the last 3 years in terms of land, and we don't know how these priorities will change in the future. The final issue is distribution of benefits. So as we all know, Scotland is very controversial in terms of its ownership pattern. A large number of areas of rural land are highly concentrated in the hands of a small number of people for historical reasons. The Scottish Government has a key priority to diversify land ownership and has created a range of very progressive community rights to buy, which can force transfer of land from private individuals. But for carbon sequestration projects, carbon projects generally, the key figure of consent and implementation for the projects are landowners. So carbon markets provide an additional source of income to those who already own a significant amount of natural resources in Scotland. And this can be particularly problematic when landowners and developers are provided with public funding through grants as additional support for the activities which then generate the carbon units. So these factors can combine to make land more expensive for local communities to purchase and create that further concentration of land ownership in Scotland. So the last thing I'm going to say is that we explore some lessons from history where there have been previous exploitations of natural resources and explain that harnessing wind energy is perhaps the most analogous to implementing carbon projects. This is because neither wind nor carbon can be owned by the landowner, but the consent of the landowner is crucial for implementation of the projects. And there have been good practice principles which have been provided for community benefits and shared ownership of onshore renewable projects, which we think could be a good template for considering in the context of carbon markets. And with that, I will pass over to Gigi for our recommendations.
Thank you, Jill. Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here. And as Jill said, I will be talking about the recommendations that we are making in this paper on the back of the findings that Jill has just introduced. So one consideration that I would like to point out before I begin talking about these recommendations is that the scope of our paper, or the remit of our paper, was very much linked to the devolved competence and devolved power. So our recommendations focuses on what we can do in Scotland as opposed to what could be done at the national or international level about the voluntary carbon markets. So in introducing our proposed recommendations or proposed models for recommendations, I would like to start with 3 general considerations that are very much at the heart of what we're trying to propose in the more specific regulatory models. So firstly, we do advocate that the approach that is currently taken to carbon markets should be more holistic and generally better integrated with other policy frameworks in Scotland. Secondly, we propose that at the moment, the government's role in the functioning of the carbon market is very much facilitative. There are certain safeguards, but by and large, carbon markets are seen as something that the government at the moment is promoting. So whilst in principle that is absolutely understandable, this is a big priority for the Scottish government, we also argue in this paper that it's time to start talking more seriously about the safeguards and about how we can ensure against the certain risks that are being produced, especially on a cumulative level in these markets. And then as the third consideration that we are trying to introduce in these recommendations is that generally at the moment, the decision-making about the functioning of the carbon markets is concentrated. It's concentrated both within the people who work within the functioning of carbon, of the two carbon codes, but it's also, it's something that many people don't really understand or feel like it's new, they should know it, but they don't necessarily know how to get, how to engage with it. So basically the proposal is that it's really time to move from a few to quite a few more stakeholders being engaged in decision making both at the policy but also at the project level. So on the back of these general considerations, we are then proposing 4 models that the Scottish government could adopt in regulating carbon markets going forward. So I can already say that the last model is the current model. So basically we continue with business as usual. It is the facilitative model which we have at the moment. On the other end of the spectrum, we suggest that at least in theory, the government could prohibit carbon trading. So a full prohibition would be a potential way forward. And this would be done mostly in favor of having a clearer understanding of how much carbon units are generated. It would be done mostly based on public resources, and it would be done primarily in order to have a clearer understanding who owns this carbon units and what is being done with them to offset what emissions. So I can already say that this model we understand is highly unlikely, mostly due to the fact that the carbon markets are already widely spread at the global level, also nationally. And in Scotland, there are many projects being registered. But we do suggest in the paper that it is always worth keeping in the back of our minds of why carbon markets are there in the first place. And that should be something that is informing policy in this area. So then we have the 2 middle models, which is where we see the main policy space is at the moment and where we should be potentially having the most intense discussion. And so the second level after prohibition would be what we call a public carbon planning model. So this is the model in which the Scottish government would be considerably more involved in the functioning of these markets than it currently is. And this involvement would consist of 2 parts. So on the one hand, the functioning of the carbon markets and the planning of where exactly the projects are being positioned, and also what kind of projects we want and who owns these projects, but also who is allowed to engage in these projects, that would be integrated a lot more into the existing planning system. So this planning system would operate at the policy level. So already there is something in the national planning framework, and also we already have woodland and forest strategies, but basically there could be more done at that level where we would have clearer criteria and clearer spatial priorities in terms of where carbon projects are being based. And then on the other hand, this planning framework would also be about better involvement with local place plans and generally the level of implementation and where exactly which projects would be taking place. Also, this public carbon planning regulatory model could entail more stringent regulatory measures. So it could further formalize the existing codes. So it could give them the statutory footing, so to speak. The government could regulate more who can be the buyers and who can sell the units. There could also be further regulatory framework about putting in place shared ownership structures with communities or better benefit sharing with communities and other local stakeholders. So the advantage of such framework is that it would indeed promote better integration with existing policy frameworks. It would be more holistic, and we would have considerably more information about how these markets function and what function they have in public policy objectives. There are, of course, multiple disadvantages or potential issues with this model. The main being that it might fragment the Scottish carbon markets from the rest of the UK carbon markets. It might also be difficult to agree on this politically, and this would require time and potentially slow down the current functioning of the carbon markets. And then finally, our third proposed model is the one that builds on what there currently is, but considerably enhances the oversight of functioning of the carbon markets. And there we propose multiple mechanisms through which current functioning of carbon markets could be better monitored, and with a also focus on better compliance with existing frameworks. And that could be done by creating a carbon commissioner, for instance, which would be modeled on the tenant farming commissioner, or by just tightening the current oversight of how carbon projects are currently being registered, validated, and verified. This would be an easier model to implement because it follows already existing patterns of carbon markets. It would probably also be faster to implement. However, at the same time, we see multiple challenges with ensuring the previously mentioned integrity with broader policy objectives, which such model might not be able to guarantee. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jill and Gigi. That was a brilliant start to this afternoon's conversation. So we'll now bring in Professor Dave Reay to give a response to this for another 5 minutes. Dave Reay is the Executive Director of the Edinburgh Climate Change Institute. He's also a Professor of Carbon Management at the University of Edinburgh, as well as being the Director of Policy at Climate Exchange and advising the Scottish Government on rural policy and climate change, and being very well published in this area. So over to you, Dave.
Thanks so much, Megan. And I'll start off just by saying for those of you, hopefully you've all read Jill and Giedre's paper, but if you haven't, definitely read it after this event. I think it's excellent, and it really does bring into some clarity some of the risks we're facing, all of us, I guess, who are interested in land use in Scotland, but also some of the ways forward, some of the solutions that they've just outlined. So what I'm going to do quickly is give my take on it, I guess, from the wider context. So going back to COP26 in Glasgow, we had some real progress made in terms of what's called the compliance carbon market. So this is where you're trading emissions internationally, and the rule book on that was agreed, and a lot of the loopholes closed. There's the big question that has just been articulated by Jill and Giedre in terms of the voluntary carbon market. And so one of the things, as ever with Scotland, is we are pushing the boundaries of what can be done, what should be done, asking these questions, hopefully with lessons, not just for us in Scotland, but globally too. So the pressure is high. The other context to this is the land use sector and the climate emergency. So to deliver on the Paris climate goals, we have to have increased sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere through land use, but it can't do the whole job. In fact, it can't get anywhere near the whole job. If we get everything right, if we think about all the land around the world that's available, all of that is in demand for food production, for biodiversity, for water quality, all sorts of demands on it. So if we got everything perfect, maybe we could go about a third of the way through land use change in terms of carbon sequestration. So it isn't some kind of silver bullet, but it does need to be part of it. So that's a kind of important context, I think, for us in Scotland too. So some of the risks that have already been articulated, I guess some of the worries as well that are running through many communities and with landowners as well here in Scotland. The ones that really stand out for me, and this is why I love the paper, is it focuses on them. One is around actually how these land-based carbon solutions, these nature-based solutions are used, and whether they are actually dealing with unavoidable emissions. That's fundamental, I think, for me, when we've got a job that they can do, but they can't do everything. And actually we've got a really constrained headspace in terms of how much more carbon we emit. Actually do the kind of land-based solutions allow us to do things, not take the actions we should take in terms of cutting emissions or avoiding emissions elsewhere. And that's a fundamental part, I think, of where the regulation probably needs to go. There are some examples of that, like the wilder climate standards, which we might talk about, where actually looking at who's permitted to buy carbon credits in this context is going to be important, I think, so that we're not just essentially using carbon sequestration for things which are avoidable. I think another real question at the moment is around money. It's around these what are called arbitrage opportunities. So land being snapped up by investors actually at a lower price than it should be because of the kind of the carbon and biodiversity futures, as it were, the kind of investment potential, and so landowners losing out. There's also worry, I think, from a lot of landowners and people who are looking to register their tree planting or peatland restoration under these schemes, that if you're then selling that carbon immediately, are you selling your credits cheap, and should you register but hold on to your credits, as it were? And certainly that's some advice I've seen recently from certain sectors in Scotland. One of the key ones also is around, all right, we're doing this in Scotland and this does need to happen, but is it taking that systems view? Are we offshoring food production, for instance? And so the carbon is essentially just leaking to other places. So that needs to be part of the context of the thinking. And the most important one for me, and this is just a personal view that's been picked up on already, is its impact on communities. Its impact on communities right now in terms of their involvement and their input and the potential hollowing out, I guess, through farms being bought up for this without actual kind of contribution to the community. But that intergenerational issue that Jill particularly picked up on, in terms of this is in it for the long term. It has to be, in terms of the permanence of the carbon, that has big impacts, big risks for our communities, potentially benefits too. So just very quickly responding to the 4 areas. So I go on the full prohibition of the market for carbon. I don't think that's a starter. You know, we've got really constrained public finances. We do need investment to allow us to make the most of our land in terms of not just carbon, but biodiversity, food production, etc. And some of that needs to be private investment. So that avenue needs to be open. Public funding can't do it all by itself. The other one I'm going to kind of rule out is the business as usual. So what is happening at the moment, I think, brings too many risks, and I've mentioned some of them, which I think are most important: the community, the additionality, the kind of the risks in terms of locking in negative outcomes is too high. So it really comes down to the public carbon planning idea and the carbon commissioner idea. For me, the public carbon planning proposal that Jill and Giedre set out, I think, is a version of that is definitely something that Scottish Government and all the stakeholders on this call should be looking at in terms of how that's realised. Yes, it will cause some issues potentially in terms of our relationship with England and other voluntary carbon markets, but actually leading the way is important with this. And if I think about my own geekiness and my own carbon blinkers, I'd probably go, oh, we don't need any of that. We just go with like a really free carbon market and go after carbon sequestration without consideration of anything else. But actually, if I take these blinkers off, it's got to be actually the preferred scenario has to be maybe fewer, maybe slower projects that deliver carbon sequestration, other benefits beyond 2030 that are robust and resilient and community supported. Crucially, that is better than any number of projects which don't have those key safeguards around additionality, permanence, and benefit sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Dave Reay. That was really fascinating. I've been scribbling down loads of notes while you've been talking. So we're now going to move over to Don MacLeod to give his response. He is a partner at Turcan Connell, and which is a firm representing a number of different clients across Scotland. He's helping particularly in new areas such as nature-based solutions to climate change, renewables, forestry investment, and other wider issues in rural and urban areas. So Don, over to you.
Thanks, Megan. 3 comments from me. First of all, getting to the topic that lawyers love to talk about, and it's risk. So the paper brings out very well the prospective benefits of carbon schemes to landowners, to communities, etc. And the paper also brings out the risk and responsibility angles, and the responsibility angles here cannot really be ignored. So if you want to sell carbon, you're effectively selling a promise that carbon will be delivered. So either the trees will grow and they will produce carbon as anticipated over the validated period, or the peatland will stay in its restored state for the duration. If that doesn't happen, then someone has a problem. So we talk about the distribution of benefits of these schemes, but we have to be very clear that we also have to tag along to that the responsibility and what happens if something goes wrong. And it does happen. There's not huge experience, I don't think, in the UK market at the moment, but there's plenty of experience on the international market. The risks are there. My opinion is that they're manageable in the Scottish context. Most recent examples being the wildfires on the west coast of America a year or 2 ago. From memory, I think it was Google and Microsoft who had heavily invested in nature-based solutions there, literally up in a puff of smoke overnight. Their response, not overly perturbed. It's a nature-based solution. They recognized that these things were at risk and will find a way to sort it out. Second point is that I think we have to recognize that carbon is really a multi-speed economy as far as land use is concerned. So some carbon schemes are going to be very invasive and will have a high impact on land use. Others, it's possible you could say that the land use impact is next to nothing. So if someone wants to plant trees all over a hillside, that's very invasive. That affects the amenity of an area, affects the local community. If you go down to the peatland carbon code, what's the actual land use impact in terms of visibility and consequence? It's possibly quite low. And then if you get to the next carbon standards coming in, the soil carbon code, the salt marsh carbon code, however these things might arise, it is possible that in actual fact, the impact of these things for the community is not all that significant. And when we talk about carbon at the moment, we are talking about a spectrum from emission reduction, so individuals taking steps to reduce their carbon footprint, that's emission reduction, restoring a peatland to reduce emission, to reduce the emissions, that's emission reduction, all the way to sequestration, so people positively doing things to sequester carbon, like growing trees or whatever it might be. And in that very broad spectrum, I think it's difficult to have a blanket policy on how you deal with all of these things, because they're all quite different. But the value of the carbon and the value of the activity and the value of the step that somebody is taking is perhaps not equally as high, but a carbon unit is a carbon unit, and whether that arises because someone's planted trees all over a hillside or because someone has done something less in terms of an emission reduction, then it's a very broad spectrum. Third comment is a very specific legal comment. We say all the time about the carbon market and doing carbon contracts that it's not settled, it's coming, it's getting more developed, but there are still a number of grey areas. I do think it is coming, it is developing, but there is a gap at the moment from a legal perspective in terms of how you actually deal with these commitments, because they're long-term commitments. They're not going to be less than 40, 50 years, they may be 100 years. So how do you secure a good carbon right over that period that will expand, it will span multi-ownerships probably, and the same questions swirl around. Is it a partnership? Is it a lease? Do we have to buy the land? Do we just have a contract? Do we have a stand security over the land to back up the contract? And these are quite technical points, but they are highly relevant, because I do think that the absence of a very established legal mechanism is holding back the voluntary market at the moment, because there are some uncertainties. Now, again, I think they're manageable. I think they can be overcome. But two easy examples: we have conservation burdens, we have climate change burdens. To my mind, ideal tools to be sorting out how we deal with carbon, but no one seems to want to actually use them. So all that just to say that I think there's some work that could be done by the government to actually create a framework from a legal and commercial point of view.
Thanks, Don. I think that call at the end about the need for a legal framework, I don't think I've heard anyone involved in these discussions disagreeing on the fact that we definitely need a policy and legislative response to certainly elements of this issue. I also think what you said there about the sort of the obligations on landowners in terms of making sure that carbon commitments are met and matched in 80 or over 100-year contract periods is also really important, because that is an element of this which is often not actually given adequate attention. So we've got a lot of questions coming in to the chat box, which I've been keeping an eye on. I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to ask a first question to Jill maybe, and then also I'm looking for sort of feedback from Don and Dave as well. Jill, one of the most interesting points that you make in your paper, and Giedre Helm also questions this, is around this question of who owns carbon and who owns the right to sequester carbon. And this is actually reflected in some of the questions as well that's coming in the chat box. Could you say a little bit more about this, Jill, and then maybe Don and Dave, if you could also respond as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Megan. I saw Clive Phillips from Brodie's, who is a former colleague, raising this question. So hello, Clive. It's an issue that I've written a blog on as well for the Scottish Land Commission, of this question of natural capital generally, who owns natural capital. And natural capital, of course, is this term which has become very, very popular and talks about lots of different elements which are part of the land, which are important, such as air, water, plants, animals, soil. But it really boils down to what, in terms of ownership, what does the landowner own? And the landowner owns the land. So Clive mentions the kind of soil is, of course, owned by the landowner, but carbon, which is moving about in the atmosphere, that's circulating through the air, is not owned by the landowner. So there's certain, it depends when you're talking about natural capital and these assets, you have to think about what we're actually talking about. So air is not owned by the landowner. The air space is owned by the landowner, but the kind of individual particles that are moving about are not the subject of ownership. So often what we're really talking about in terms of carbon projects is who has the entitlement to be able to set up a carbon project. So that is plant a woodland, restore a peatland, and take part in these incentivized projects, which the Scottish Government is set up in order to sell carbon units. So in terms of kind of ownership of carbon, I think that's kind of a distracting concept away from the fact that we're really talking about land and who is entitled to do what on the land, which of course is a historically very controversial issue in Scotland.
Thank you, Jill. Don, over to you.
Yeah, so when a lawyer says it's interesting, that's never really the answer that you actually want, but it is interesting. If you strip it back in terms of the voluntary market, this might not be quite on the mark, but effectively, I do stuff so that you can say stuff. That's what it's about. So landowner does stuff like planting trees so that carbon offsetter can say stuff that they are carbon neutral or whatever it might be. So it really is about that right to say or take a particular position on carbon because of some related land management thing that's happened. And the land management thing is either planting trees, or it's restoring peatland, or it's the salt marsh stuff, or it's doing regenerative farming so that you are emitting less carbon in your farming practice. All those things qualify under the current codes so that people can then say something because a certain land management thing has happened. And I think that's the crux of the matter, rather than so much about who actually owns a carbon particle or a carbon thing that might be floating over the farm.
Thank you, Don. Dave?
Yeah, so my take on this is more about the actual ownership, as in the legal ownership of the land, and this I think it's referred to in the paper, and it's coming up frequently in terms of concerns around that land ownership versus tenancy and crofts as well, in terms of that voluntary carbon market, the access to it, and that benefit sharing as well. One of the aspects that this worries me kind of personally, because I'm doing it as a landowner who has grazing on my land, and I'm reducing that. And so essentially the tenancy agreement is one which is becoming less useful probably to the sheep farmer, and for the forested areas, if I went down the route of monetizing that through the carbon markets, and that money would come to me. And that, you know, if you multiplied that across large areas of Scotland, then you've got a situation for a lot of tenant farmers where your livelihood disappears, unless you're going to get into the woodland management, and that's going to be, you know, what supports your livelihood. I think there's a real risk there actually of this just transition. One of the things that we hear a huge amount about, quite rightly, across the world in terms of tackling climate change is we need to realise a just transition. Scotland leads the way in this. A lot of the emphasis of this has been around the energy sector, the oil and gas sector. I think for our sector, in terms of agriculture and land use, the way carbon markets apply and the way we might see land use change as part of that, just transition needs to be at the heart. So if we end up with some kind of framework with the Scottish Government, I'd hope, front and centre in terms of taking responsibility around the voluntary carbon market, just transition needs to be part of that, in terms of those tenant farmers, in terms of our crofters, in terms of that intergenerational part, again, that Jill articulated so well.
Thanks, Dave. And that's a brilliant link to the next question, actually, which I was going to put to Gigi. Well, there's been a couple of questions here about what's needed both in practice and policy around improving community engagement, and then the point made by Alistair Scott around the fact that consultation, engagement and participation are all different with different processes and outcomes. Gigi, you touched a little bit of this in the paper. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about where we might look to for good models on which to base the kind of community engagement requirements that we need in order to make sure that the benefits and the risks are you know, being equitably considered and shared. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Megan. Actually, before I answer that, I really wanted to pick up on Don's point about the blanket regulation, because I think this kind of is partially, at least at the heart of this. Because when we started talking about the arguments in this paper with multiple stakeholders, we heard this a lot, that okay, but this is not all, not all schemes are made equal. Some are actually really small, they're owned by communities. So actually the community engagement aspect, they would be very different from having, I don't know, a big plantation, which is, 50% monoculture, and then, with some biodiversity sprinkled on top of it. So I really want to acknowledge that. I think this is something that we all have to be very aware of when we're talking about improving community engagement. So it will depend on the project, and it will depend on the kind of carbon sequestration or emissions reduction that are being done. But I think this is why talking about the framework solutions are so important, right? So basically, that's why I would also probably personally favor some sort of planning approach, because that's the only place where you can strategically think at which level of governance should come in and at which level of governance the community should be involved and for what project. Right, so I think because there's a real risk of kind of demanding too much and then slowing down the market and making it sort of the sequestration, something that people don't want to do because there's too much, requirements which no one wants to fulfill. So that's where the government role really comes in. So in terms of good models, I think what Jill was telling previously about looking at wind. So I think we already have certainly some good practices there. So community benefit sharing and shared ownership principles. So there's already definitely quite a lot we can learn from there, including what doesn't work, and in order to avoid the potential tokenism of sort of creating the benefits which only allow to tick the box, right? So we definitely already have ongoing projects in other sectors which we can look at, and then use the good practices from that. Yeah, I don't know if Jill wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Gigi, and that we can learn from also some of the problems that we have seen in terms of wind. That creates the same problems that the large landowners have the best capability, for example, of implementing these projects. Oh, there's a bit of interview. Oh, there we go. They have the best capability, but you can crowd out communities. So one thing that we really had a good suggestion from one of our stakeholders was that communities maybe needed to be supported in engaging with large landowners and developers to understand the projects and to understand their role in the projects. Because if you just have very basic publication in a public register or in a local newspaper, you really might not get very far. And in these communities there are people with full-time jobs like us that don't necessarily have a huge amount of time to be scrolling on public registers to find out what's happening in their local area. So there could be more support for communities, I think, to really know how to engage in these projects and understand what kind of benefits they could get out of the projects as well. Because there is a tension with community engagement that it is just putting a lot of burden on communities as well, to tell the developers, tell the landowners what they want and what they need, which can be a challenge as well to articulate that.
Thank you. Sorry, carry on, Giedre.
So just to add maybe one consideration, so it is the case that a lot of the projects are very professionalized, right? So this is something that is apparent, that, in order to plan the project, to design it, in order to make it profitable, you really need just professional lawyers and finance specialists and people who deal with carbon finance. So it is actually a lot of it, just to echo what Jill has said, this is well, I mean, it's a bit cliche, but it is effectively about sharing, like increasing the knowledge at the community level to be able to engage with these processes, because often it's just very difficult to engage with it if you don't really understand the project.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I'm having issues with my mute button. Thanks. It's really interesting to hear those different perspectives. There've been a number of different comments. a lot of what's in the paper and the discussions we've had so far in terms of the sort of recommendations have looked at what action the Scottish Government and sort of policy can provide. But there've been a number of comments in the chat function which have sort of taken a step back and looked beyond Scotland. We've had reference to the various different ISO standards being evolved. We've got the new additionality elements being strengthened within the peatland code and the woodland code. We've got the EU sustainable finance taxonomy, which after years of being in the sort of pipeline is finally possibly going to be having an impact on the way in which the financial sector is involved itself and regulates itself and behaves itself within these issues. Does anyone want to say about the sort of anything about the way in which we might see the international standard framework having an influence on what's happening in Scotland?
If I can maybe say, Megan, if I was a UK standard, to be provocative, I might be worried, because not so long ago, the international standards were patchy. There were some very poor projects. People would turn up wherever they might turn up, and there'd be no trees at all. The verification, validation was all patchy. There's now a lot of excellent international projects. I think the particular problem in the UK context is the woodland carbon code. Now, maybe to say problem is not the right word, but it's now actually pretty difficult to get carbon units on new planting. There was a period where it was relatively easy to get, or possible, well, maybe that's a better way to put it, on commercial schemes, carbon units not as high, obviously, as native schemes that would never be cut down. But now it really is pretty difficult. So people who want to do carbon schemes in Scotland using trees are using native broadleaf schemes. Will they grow as well? They might not. So what's going to happen if this has become much more difficult in the woodland context? Will people stick with the UK market? Will they pay the higher prices in the UK market, or will they carry on, as I think most UK polluters do their offsetting abroad, where the standards have risen? The additionality rule, and I know there's different views on it, but just by way of a very brief explanation, you can only get carbon finance on new schemes. So if you own land and trees have been growing for 20 years, but this is all pre the carbon stuff, then you can't claim credits, even though as a matter of fact, your trees are hoovering up carbon. As I say, different views on that, I know, but I think New Zealand have a 5-year or 6-year look back. So if you're not quite there, but the trees are quite new, you can still do it. So there's all kinds of things that happen that actually do hoover up carbon. But I just put the question out there, is it becoming too difficult, or will it be too difficult in the future? So certainly on trees, given the changes to the code.
Thank you. Giedre, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add maybe that I think there is an opportunity for a virtuous circle where the international standards are growing, they're becoming more comprehensive, we have different levels of standards being introduced, and therefore the domestic standards, for one of a better word, they have to take on the best practices, and therefore those standards are also becoming more comprehensive. We're talking about the bundling of different advantages coming from carbon and increasing the quality of carbon, right? So I think there is an opportunity for that approach and for international standards to play a role here. I do, however, worry that we are losing this issue of integrated policy objectives when we are going down that route. And whilst we can hope for international standards to have a role, it's not going to replace effectively a government having a full oversight of cumulative impacts and cumulative risks of these markets. So in that respect, I would just caution against putting too much faith on international and European or other levels of governance doing everything that has to be done in order to regulate the markets.
Thank you both, Gigi and Don. Does anyone else have anything they want to say on this? Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, it was just to pick up on that last point that quality is really important in this, in terms of it not just being about carbon. And so if we have arguably more projects which maybe aren't about commercial Sitka spruce and really high yield classes, lots of carbon uptake, but aren't giving us a lot of the other ancillary benefits or bigger benefits in many cases across long-term carbon, biodiversity and amenity, then you know, that might be something actually in Scotland where we are more about actual quality. I guess it comes down for me always to that place-based part of it, and some of the questions in the text have brought that up, that actually if you're going to get this right, you need to understand things down to that local level. Back to that community question, you know, you can have national strategies for community engagement, but that really needs to be implemented and work well at that local level. And so one of the things I think actually that Jill and Giedre mention in their paper is the regional land use partnership. So that's a structure within Scotland already about trying to do this. Again, you know, in Scotland, we've kind of led the way in some respects about thinking about this, about thinking about place-based decision-making on land use and engagement. And we've got some of those structures, which I think if I had to come up with my vision of 10 years time, how we're running the voluntary carbon market in Scotland, it'll be one where wherever you are in Scotland, if a project is going forward, you know about it, you can engage in it, you can give input to it, and actually, you know, it gives something to you. It gives something to you, you know, as an individual, but to your community. And that might mean, going back to my earlier point, that we have fewer projects, we maybe sequester less carbon than we could physically in Scotland through land use change, but they are more sustainable projects for the whole of Scotland, rather than just for that carbon blinkered view that people like me might argue is the way forward.
Thanks, Dave. I mean, I think it's really good actually to land back in the kind of question of the role that embedding these carbon and natural capital investments within the wider landscape and a landscape scale thinking is really, really important. And certainly from the Land Commission's perspective, the role that regional land use partnerships, the land use strategy and local place plans, as Jill and Gigi pull out in their paper, can play is really, really important. Now, we've only got a few minutes left. One set of questions that we haven't really touched on have related to the role that some of the fiscal measures can play, the role of taxation, annual ground rent and other things. Jill, this was actually something that we had discussed as we were kind of just preparing for the session before we started. Is this something that you'd like to say a little bit about in terms of the role that these kind of mechanisms can play in helping us find the solution to some of these risks?
Yes, thank you. So I think the selling of carbon units and carbon markets is really thinking about incentives. But if we consider all of the options, then there is also the option of, you know, the stick rather than the carrot. So I think if we're looking at the way to tackle the climate crisis, we have to consider all options. And I would be very in favour of considering the option of climate tax, other types of financial disincentives, which take finance away from those with the greatest resources. And there are definitely policy proposals which have been put forward by other bodies. Of course, we're limited within the devolution settlement, but it's useful to not just think of incentives. We can also think of other ways in which landowners can be encouraged to make changes.
Thank you, Jill. I'm afraid I've only got a couple of minutes left. This is something that I feel I could talk about with all of you and everybody for much longer than an hour, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to start drawing it to a close. I wanted to thank Jill and Giedre and Dave and Don for their time in reading and preparing and contributing to this conversation this afternoon. I'd like to thank Jess and Sarah from my colleagues at the Land Commission for helping to make the technology side run so smoothly. And I'd also finally like to thank all of you for participating and joining in this conversation. There's been some fascinating comments and some really useful links added in to the chat box. So make sure you get a chance to click on them before we leave the session. Please take a moment to fill out the survey so that we can get some feedback on how this went and what we can think about in terms of improving future sessions. It's very clear, even amongst the panelists, we have different opinions about the range of different solutions available to us. To what extent, as Jill said, do we want to be using incentives in terms of carrots or more regulatory sticks? What is required, and at what scale are we trying to look at finding the solution? Is it down at the local level in terms of local place plans, regional or national level, or even what role does the international frameworks play here? So, as I said, this is the second of a series of conversations that the Land Commission is trying to enable us all to discuss and really wrangle out what are this is a very tricky and challenging situation. It's not the first and it won't be the last natural resource boom in Scotland, but we have to bring our best heads together and think about what the kind of range of solutions, both in terms of practical changes that can practical changes that can take place on the ground in terms of responsible land ownership, use and management, as well as the kind of solutions we might see coming in, changes in policy and regulation. And the Land Commission is committed to enabling this conversation and enabling us to begin to come together and think about what the concrete actions are that we need across all the different sectors and levels of engagement where there's space for change. So thank you very much for this. Keep an eye on our website and the Land Commission social media feed where we will be advertising future events and discussions. And thank you very much all for joining this afternoon, and goodbye.